Bran Black, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks so much for having me.
How would the reform fund that you're proposing see more houses built more quickly?
Well, let's take it back a step and just look at some of the challenges that we're facing right now. For a start, we know we need more supply. So the federal government, together with the states, has fixed on a target of 1.2 million homes over the course of the next 5 years. Now, what that translates to per year is about 9,000 new homes 9 homes per 1,000 people. At the moment, we're delivering 6 homes per 1,000 people. So there's a gap. And what we've done with our report is put forward a whole series of recommendations which help address that supply gap. And one of the things that we've noted is that there is often a challenge associated with these big reform pieces like stamp duty. And in those circumstances, it's useful to have some federal assistance. So we've proposed a reform fund. It's modelled on the types of reform funds that we've seen utilised in the late 90s and the early 2000s, competition payments paid to states. That was $5 billion then, and that's translated into $60 billion a year in uplift to our GDP. We think that that's an important initiative.
Now, the federal government has already announced a performance-based fund for states and territories who exceed their home building targets under the National Housing Accord. What's different in your proposal to what's already on the table from the government?
Well, we think that those are already important initiatives that have been announced. But what we're saying is that the type of reforms that we're proposing and which should be incentivised through additional federal funding, as per this National Reform Fund, are productivity enhancing reforms. So our 29 recommendations are really efficiency driving, productivity enhancing reforms in the housing sector. But I would stress that we think that this is a reform fund that could apply more broadly in other areas to help drive productivity uplift. So it might be with respect to regulation, it could be with respect to how you manage payroll taxes and so on. But we think that it's got an important role to play in housing as well.
Now, just in housing, why is removing stamp duty, as you're talking about in this report, why is that so central in your view to solving the housing crisis?
Stamp duty is effectively a tax on mobility. And think about it through the prism of a family. You might have a couple that have kids that have moved out of home. They're now empty nesters. They're looking at potentially downsizing, but they're disincentivised from doing that because they know that they'll have to pay a large upfront cost associated with stamp duty if they take that critical step. So as a consequence of that, they're going to continue occupying a larger home than what they need, which means that the supply of that larger home, which could be available for a younger family that has that need, just isn't there. We think it's an important part of driving that type of mobility.
Now, so the Victoria today has announced a 1-year freeze on stamp duty for anyone buying a property off the plan. Should the other states follow Victoria?
We think that this is an important initiative. We think that any step that you can take to try and incrementally dispense with stamp duty is an important step forward. One of the things that's really interesting in undertaking this body of work that we've done is that a lot of the reforms that we're calling for have already been implemented in one jurisdiction or another. So you might say Queensland's got a fantastic concierge service. You might say that New South Wales has a really good approach to data transparency on council performance. South Australia has an excellent consolidated zoning system, and WA's got a really decent approach around how it goes about assessing.
You want all of those improvements in all states and territories?
We'd love to say wrap it up, harmonise it across the board. So with respect to your question specifically on Victoria, we think that there probably are learnings that you could apply here, and no doubt Victoria will be looking to see what happens over the course of the next year.
Now, they're talking about a freeze, and part of the reason they're talking about a freeze is that is the income that derives from stamp duty. They're not prepared to give that away yet. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? You're asking the states to give away a very large amount of income.
That is one of the challenges with stamp duty. If you go from that very large lump sum payment, which states have come to rely upon, and you replace that with a smaller payment, a much smaller payment, that's paid out over years, then particularly in the early years, that represents a real upfront cost to states. That's where we think that a national reform fund...
So the money would come out of the reform fund?
Indeed, it could very much assist in that regard.
Let me just talk about the business side of this, because business has a responsibility in here as well, and I'm thinking in particular about the practice of land banking, that is holding on to land that has been rezoned. Do you think that business should be looking at its own practices when it comes to not moving quickly enough on land that's available to be built on?
Well, we think it's really important to try and move forward as quickly as possible. We know that there are lots of different challenges that come into play in that
More
regard.
precisely, does business have a responsibility when it comes to land banking? Let me just give you some figures, because according to KPMG, in Sydney alone, the approved but not commenced category has reached a 5-year high, with more than 12,000 projects waiting to be commenced.
Well, again, I'd say that we should be moving forward as quickly as possible, but there are lots of reasons why people aren't able to move forward. So from our members, what we get is feedback with respect to the cost of debt, which has obviously gone up in the last couple of years, and of course the cost associated with supply of labour and the cost associated with the supply of materials. All of these factors are coming into play.
They're important business decisions, but if we are in a crisis and we're asking state governments and federal governments to act, doesn't business have to act at the same time?
We've all got a responsibility to do that. I absolutely agree with you in that regard. My point is simply that there is a multiplicity of factors that are affecting decisions about whether or not development should proceed, and a lot of that right now really does come down to increased costs.
But some of it's profit margin too, isn't it?
Well, you've got to make sure that developments are able to proceed in a profitable way. One of the challenges that we're seeing at the moment is that productivity in the construction sector has declined significantly. So productivity across our economy more broadly has increased by about 10% over the last decade. In the construction sector, it's actually reduced by more than 10% in the last decade. And we have reports through some of our members that productivity on sites is down to about 2.5 days a week. So we've got to look at really what we can do to try and enhance the scope for them to see profitability and to see margins through their developments.
Let's just look at some of the policies that are on offer from both sides of politics, or all sides of politics. So the Coalition wants to impose a 10-year freeze on changes to the National Construction Code. Does the BCA support that?
Well, we think that that's an interesting policy. It's certainly worth looking at. One of the benefits associated with it is, of course, that it means that there's less of a compliance burden. There's not as much change. We also know that there are some important changes that are made to these codes over time, but it is something that we're looking at very closely.
So where are you on that? Because obviously some of those codes, some of the requirements of the code are to do with energy efficiency, aren't they?
Indeed they are.
So a blanket 10-year freeze, yes or no?
Well, at this stage, we're still looking at it. It's one of those things that we've still got to discuss and consult on with our members. But we are very interested in what the Coalition's announced in terms of the additional assistance in relation to infrastructure. That's actually one of our specific recommendations in our report.
Does the BCA support changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax?
Well, it's another interesting point. What I would say in that regard is that it goes directly to demand, and our report that we've released today goes to supply side measures. What we're trying to do there is address specifically that 1.2 million deficit that we need to attend to over the course of the next 5 years, and that's why we've put forward the changes that we have. In terms of your question specifically though, we would say that we don't support changes with respect to negative gearing. And the reason for that is that we favour simplicity in the tax system, and we see that it is a well understood principle that you should be able to deduct the costs that you've incurred in the course of producing assessable income. In terms of capital gains tax, what we would say there is that there is a basis for a conversation in that regard, but it's important to remember that at the end of the day, capital gains tax is paid on a whole series of different assets. So we would welcome that kind of discussion in the context of a broader discussion on tax reform, which we think is necessary in any case.
Bran Black, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.